Kid Norfolk made white promoters rich, and their reward was forcing him to fight completely blind. In 1921, he blinded a boxing legend. Just 5 years later, his own eyes failed. Instead of giving him medical care, the promoters bribed doctors and faked his health records. They pushed a blind man into the ring to take punches he couldn't see, simply because his name still sold tickets. To the boxing cartel, Norfolk wasn't a human being. He was just a piece of equipment. When he was completely blind and couldn't fight anymore, they fired him and left him with nothing. Hit like, subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments. Let's get into the facts. The systemic exploitation of William Ward did not begin in a boxing ring. It started decades earlier in the dirt of Belmont, Virginia, where he was born on July 10, 1893. Born to illiterate laborers operating at the absolute bottom of the economic ladder, Ward recognized early that uneducated physical labor was a permanent financial trap. He systematically taught himself how to read and write, viewing basic education as a fundamental survival tool. When his family relocated to Norfolk Street in Baltimore, Maryland, the teenage Ward confronted a blunt reality. Literacy provided intelligence, but it did not provide the immediate cash required to avoid starvation in an industrial city. Analyzing his own body, he concluded that his physical output was the only tradable asset he possessed to generate capital. Driven by the need for a higher wage, Ward joined the massive labor migration, leaving the United States to build the Panama Canal in Central America. He was assigned to the heavy digging crews in the Culebra Cut, where he spent 10 to 12 hours a day swinging a heavy pickaxe into unstable rock and thick mud under suffocating humidity and temperatures exceeding 100 degrees. The grueling, repetitive motion of driving steel into solid earth fundamentally reconstructed his anatomy, stripping away all body fat and building a dense, compacted frame of bone and muscle. Standing 5 feet 10 inches tall, his weight stabilized between 170 and 178 pounds, giving him an abnormal, top-heavy weight distribution that generated immense kinetic force. Observing the underground fights organized by canal workers to gamble their meager wages, Ward realized he could generate more capital in a few minutes of violent combat than he could in a month of moving dirt. He entered these unregulated brawls using the raw, unpolished strength forged in the trenches to simply batter other men into submission. Treating the violence strictly as a trade rather than a pursuit of athletic glory, he dropped his birth name and adopted the moniker Kid Norfolk to represent the Baltimore street where he grew up. Determined to test his market value in the professional American boxing circuit, Ward returned to Maryland and secured his first official bout at the Alba Theater on November 29, 1910. Facing a trained fighter named Kid Jasper, Ward relied entirely on brute strength, throwing wide, heavy punches that left him entirely exposed. Jasper utilized basic distance management, timing, and footwork to avoid the heavy shots, landing precise counterpunches to defeat Ward on points. Ward processed the defeat clinically, recognizing that raw canal-forged power was useless against professional-grade opposition unless it was mechanically refined. He immediately returned to the tropical boxing circuits of Panama to completely rebuild his fighting system. Acknowledging that he was shorter than most heavyweights, Ward weaponized his height disadvantage by training himself to launch forward at a 45-degree angle, using his dense 178-pound frame as a battering ram. He learned to step inside his opponent's reach, drive his reinforced skull into their chest or chin to break their posture, and fire short, concussive hooks directly into their ribs and organs. By January 1914, his internal mechanics were fully dialed in, allowing him to systematically trap and knock out Abe Hollanderski, a highly experienced and durable veteran with hundreds of logged rounds. Having proven his mechanics against professional opposition, Ward continued to clear out the local talent until promoters booked him for the Panama Heavyweight Championship on November 12, 1916. His opponent was Jeff Clark, an incredibly dangerous veteran, in a fight scheduled for 20 rounds in oppressive, oxygen-depleting tropical heat. Ward applied relentless, forward-moving pressure for the entire hour of combat, absorbing Clark's strikes to close the distance, punishing the veteran's body, and ultimately winning the decision to secure the title. This regional dominance forced international promoters to test his market viability against a higher-tier asset, matching him against Arthur Pelkey, a white fighter and former contender for the world white heavyweight title. Ward treated the high-profile bout as a clinical execution, systematically breaking the bigger man down with targeted body blows before landing a massive concussive shot to the jaw in the 13th round that knocked Pelkey completely unconscious. Having extracted maximum financial and promotional value from the Central American circuit, Kid Norfolk packed his bags and boarded a ship back to America, ready to sell his violence to the highest bidders in the primary casino and syndicate markets. When William Ward stepped off the boat in the United States, he was entering a highly organized, legally protected financial cartel. The American boxing industry in the early 20th century was not a sport. It was an unregulated, brutal monopoly controlled by a syndicate of promoters, casino operators, and organized crime figures. Their entire business model relied on extracting maximum revenue from the working-class masses through gate receipts and illegal gambling syndicates. To maximize this revenue, the promoters needed marketable assets, and in the racially segregated environment of 1910s America, the most lucrative asset was a white champion. Ward arrived carrying a completely different set of physical metrics. Standing 5 feet 10 inches tall, he weighed a dense, heavily muscled 178 pounds. Stripped of all excess fat by years of grueling canal labor, he looked and operated like a moving block of concrete. Most heavyweights of the era were significantly taller, but Ward neutralized his vertical disadvantage with a vicious, highly calculated offensive system. He launched his compact frame upward at a 45-degree angle, using his heavily reinforced skull to break his opponent's posture before driving devastating hooks into their vital organs. This mechanical brutality terrified the boxing establishment. The syndicate's primary asset during this era was Jack Dempsey, a fighter marketed as the absolute pinnacle of American strength and masculinity. Dempsey was a ferocious puncher, but his management team, led by the shrewd and ruthless Jack Doc Kearns, recognized the severe financial risk Ward posed. Kearns operated on a strict risk-to-reward ratio. Stepping into the ring with a compacted, canal-hardened brawler like Ward offered zero financial upside and a massive risk of physical destruction. Consequently, Dempsey's management explicitly and permanently avoided any contractual negotiations with Ward. To protect their white assets from being physically dismantled by black fighters, the boxing cartel strictly enforced an unwritten, industry-wide embargo known as the color line. This was not merely a product of social prejudice. It was a cold, calculated business mechanism designed to protect the syndicate's investments. The color line operated as an impenetrable financial wall. It explicitly barred black fighters from competing for the World Heavyweight Championship and effectively locked them out of the highest-paying main event slots. Promoters feared that if a black man consistently destroyed their white champions, it would shatter the myth of white physical superiority, infuriate the white gambling base, and instantly collapse their ticket sales. To enforce this embargo and justify the exclusion, the boxing brokers utilized the mainstream sports media as their personal public relations firm. The newspaper reporters of the era were entirely complicit in the syndicate's operations, relying on promoters for access, free tickets, and under-the-table payouts. In exchange, the press manufactured a relentless, racist narrative to dehumanize black fighters and justify their exclusion from elite competition. This coordinated media assault reached its peak when Ward was booked to fight the massive 6'6" heavyweight Big Bill Tate at Madison Square Garden in 1920. Tate was a towering figure, serving as Jack Dempsey's primary sparring partner. The Syndicate booked the fight purely as a spectacle, a segregated exhibition designed to amuse a white audience without risking a white contender. The New York media immediately went to work degrading the event. The Daily News publicly referred to Ward and Tate as blackbirds and officially dismissed the professional boxing match as a coconut throwing contest. When Ward walked into the ring at Madison Square Garden, he was greeted by 14,000 screaming white spectators who had paid strictly to mock him. The journalism of the era stripped away any pretense of athletic respect. Damon Runyon, one of the most famous and highly paid sports writers in American history, led the campaign to systematically humiliate Ward in print. Runyon openly referred to the 30-year-old veteran as a tar baby. He published articles explicitly stating that Ward had a small, round head that lacked the internal space required for basic human cognition. Other major newspapers followed Runyon's lead, referring to Ward as an orangutan and publishing pseudoscientific articles claiming that black fighters possessed leftover gorilla structures that made them impervious to pain but incapable of strategic thought. These were not fringe publications. These were the papers of record, heavily circulating these insults to millions of readers every morning to ensure the color line remained justified in the public consciousness. The reality was the exact opposite of the media's manufactured narrative. Ward possessed an incredibly sharp, analytical mind. Every morning, the illiterate laborer who had taught himself to read would purchase the major newspapers and study the sports pages. He read every racist insult, every degrading cartoon, and every dehumanizing paragraph published by Runyon and the Syndicate's reporters. He did not react with public outrage, nor did he attempt to appeal to their morality. Ward processed the vicious racism with cold, calculated detachment. He recognized that the media's insults were simply part of the systemic machinery designed to keep his payouts low. He viewed professional boxing as a completely transactional business. He understood the fundamental economics of Madison Square Garden. The 14,000 white men in the crowd were not paying to see him achieve glory, and they were certainly not paying to respect his humanity. They were paying to see a black man bleed. Instead of allowing the psychological warfare to break him, Ward absorbed the dehumanization and used it to fuel his leverage at the negotiating table. He accepted the reality that he was operating inside a rigged casino. If the promoters required him to play the role of the unthinking brute to sell tickets, he would step into the ring and deliver the extreme violence they demanded, but only if the check cleared. He knew the color line locked him out of the millions generated by championship bouts, forcing him to fight twice as often and twice as hard just to secure a living wage. Behind the walls of his training camps, Ward meticulously analyzed the contracts, tracked the gate receipts, and prepared his body for the next slaughterhouse assignment. The American Boxing Syndicate had successfully weaponized the press to isolate him, but they severely underestimated the financial discipline of a man who had already survived the mud and dynamite of the Panama Canal. Ward was preparing to force the cartel's hand by executing a level of violence in the ring that could no longer be ignored, setting the stage for one of the most brutal and consequential collisions in boxing history. August 29, 1921. Forbes Field, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The financial brokers who controlled the American Boxing Syndicate authorized a high-stakes collision. The match was strictly a calculated business maneuver. The establishment needed to placate the growing public demand to see Kid Norfolk tested against elite white opposition, but they refused to risk their heavyweight champion, Jack Dempsey. Instead, they selected Harry Greb to act as the enforcer of the color line. Greb was an active boxing legend. The press called him the human windmill. He was vicious, relentless, and widely considered one of the most dangerous men on the planet. For the promoters, Greb was the perfect gatekeeper. He was tasked with defending the pride of the white boxing establishment and permanently neutralizing the threat that Norfolk posed to their segregated financial structure. For William Ward, this fight was not about pride. It was the only available window to smash through the financial blockade. If he could destroy Greb on a massive public stage, the Syndicate would run out of excuses. They would have to give him a shot at the heavyweight title and the massive casino money that came with it. The physical disparity between the two men was immediate and stark. When they stepped onto the scales, Ward held a massive structural advantage. He weighed in at 170 pounds. Greb weighed 152 pounds. Ward carried an 18-pound advantage of dense canal-forged muscle. The promoters ignored the weight discrepancy. They believed Greb's overwhelming volume and unorthodox aggression would exhaust and break the black challenger. They were wrong. Ward possessed a clinical understanding of his own kinetic force. He did not intend to outbox Greb. He intended to walk through him. The locker rooms at Forbes Field were tense. The atmosphere was highly volatile. The white audience expected a swift execution of the black fighter. Instead, they witnessed a calculated demolition of their champion. The opening bell rang, and violence immediately erupted. Greb rushed forward, throwing punches from all angles, expecting Ward to retreat. Ward did not take a single step backward. He stepped directly into Greb's attack radius. He absorbed Greb's volume without flinching and immediately imposed his massive weight advantage. Ward initiated a brutal inside fighting strategy. He closed the distance, trapped Greb against the ropes, and drove his reinforced skull directly into Greb's chest. For the first 5 rounds, Ward completely dominated the fight. He systematically targeted Greb's ribs and internal organs with short, concussive hooks. The damage was cumulative and severe. Ward was physically breaking down the Syndicate's enforcer. In the 3rd round, the assault reached a critical apex. Ward backed Greb into a corner. He slipped a wide punch from Greb and planted his feet. Ward transferred the full kinetic energy of his 170-pound frame into his right arm and launched a massive hook. The punch bypassed Greb's guard and detonated completely flush against Greb's right eye. The physical trauma of the impact was catastrophic. The blunt force smashed into the orbital bone and sent a shock wave directly into the eyeball. The sheer hydrostatic pressure of the impact instantly severed the internal structures of Greb's eye. The retina completely detached from the back of the eye wall. Greb's knees buckled. Ward dropped him to the canvas. Greb survived the count. He was a survivor of extreme violence, and he possessed an abnormal pain tolerance. He managed to stand up and survive the remainder of the round. Greb shifted his strategy, utilizing holding, wrestling, and illegal tactics to slow Ward's forward momentum. The fight went the distance. Because official judging was often outlawed in Pennsylvania at the time to curb gambling corruption, the outcome was determined by a newspaper decision. The Syndicate-controlled sports writers sitting at ringside declared Greb the winner. It was a completely manufactured narrative to protect the white fighter's market value. The press gave Greb the victory, but Ward gave Greb a permanent physical deficit. The immediate medical reality was deliberately concealed from the public. Greb was completely irreversibly blind in his right eye. The medical technology of 1921 could not reattach a retina. If the athletic commissions discovered that Greb was fighting with one eye, his license would be permanently revoked. His earning potential would evaporate. The syndicate promoters, Greb's management, and Greb himself immediately initiated a massive multi-year medical cover-up. They bribed doctors. They falsified medical records. Before mandatory pre-fight physicals, Greb's handlers would steal the eye charts. Greb, possessing a highly retentive memory, memorized the exact sequence of letters on the chart. When the corrupt commission doctors asked him to cover his good eye and read the board, Greb recited the letters perfectly from memory. The boxing machine allowed Greb to continue fighting for 5 more years with a severe handicap. His right eye physically deteriorated and began to turn opaque. To maintain the illusion of health for the press photographs, Greb eventually had the dead eye surgically removed and replaced with a glass prosthetic. He fought the remainder of his high-level championship bouts, taking heavy blows to the head with a piece of painted glass sitting in his eye socket. The systemic negligence eventually caught up to him. The years of accumulated physical trauma, combined with the stress of the secret injury, broke his body down. Greb died on an operating table in 1926 at the age of 32. The Pittsburgh fight was a cold, indisputable message delivered by William Ward. He proved to the American boxing establishment exactly how dangerous his fists were. He had physically permanently dismantled one of their most valuable and protected assets. In a legitimate sporting structure, destroying a top contender would guarantee a title shot. In the casino capitalism of the 1920s boxing syndicate, it guaranteed the exact opposite. The promoters analyzed the aftermath of Forbes Field. They looked at Greb's ruined eye. They realized that putting Jack Dempsey in the ring with Ward was financial suicide. If Ward shattered Dempsey's jaw or blinded him, the syndicate would lose millions in future gate receipts. The cartel made a swift, unanimous business decision. They did not reward Kid Norfolk. They quarantined him. The promoters tightened the color line. They instituted a total blackout, completely isolating Ward from any high-level, lucrative bouts against white contenders. They classified him as an extreme liability. The system explicitly determined that Ward was too destructive to be allowed near the championship machinery. He had proven his superiority, and his reward was absolute financial exile. Locked out of the primary market, Ward was about to be shoved into a completely unregulated secondary meat grinder, where the financial compensation was fractional and the physical cost would ultimately demand his own vision. Completely exiled from the white championship market, William Ward was forced into a segregated financial containment zone. The architect of this system was Tex Rickard. Rickard was a ruthless cartel boss, a master promoter who controlled Madison Square Garden and dictated the economics of American boxing. In 1921, Rickard officially created the World Colored Light Heavyweight Championship. To the uneducated public, it sounded like an honor. In reality, it was a financial quarantine. The syndicate needed a mechanism to monetize high-level black fighters without ever risking their white contenders. They locked the black fighters inside this internal meat grinder. The cartel forced them to fight each other repeatedly, month after month, in a closed-loop slaughterhouse. The economics of the colored circuit were explicitly designed for exploitation. A white contender fighting a main event at Madison Square Garden made tens of thousands of dollars. A black fighter in the colored circuit made a fraction of that baseline, and corrupt management routinely skimmed 70% of the purse off the top. Ward entered this loop strictly to survive. He had no other market access. The brutal reality was that his permanent physical disintegration had already begun months before he even stepped into the ring with Greb. On May 30th, 1921, trapped in the grueling secondary circuits, he traveled to Phoenix, Arizona, to fight Lee Anderson. During the exchange, Ward took massive, unmitigated blunt force trauma directly to his left eye. The orbital bone fractured. The eye swelled completely shut, blinding him on his left side. In the 9th round, unable to see incoming strikes, he was forced to quit. The referee declared a technical knockout. The immediate swelling eventually subsided, but the internal damage was permanent. The blood vessels inside his eye were ruptured. Vitreous gel was severely compromised. In the 1920s boxing syndicate, there was no medical leave. Taking time off to heal meant immediate starvation. Management simply stopped paying. Ward ignored the visual decay and kept fighting. On December 20, 1921, he fought Jamaica Kid at Madison Square Garden. He battered his opponent and officially claimed the colored light heavyweight title. The belt was a worthless piece of metal. It did not guarantee larger purses or mainstream recognition. It only guaranteed that he would be hunted by every other desperate, underpaid fighter inside the quarantine zone. Ward recognized that the light heavyweight division was a financial dead end. He made a highly calculated, suicidal gamble to break into the heavyweight money. On March 2, 1922, Ward formally challenged Harry Wills. Wills was the reigning colored heavyweight champion. The physical discrepancy was staggering. Ward weighed 170 pounds. Wills weighed nearly 200 pounds. Wills was massive, highly skilled, and possessed lethal, one-punch knockout power. Ward stepped into the ring completely undersized, relying entirely on his aggression. He attempted to launch himself inside and work the body. The strategy failed completely. Wills utilized his massive weight advantage, leaned his body directly onto Ward to exhaust him, and then detonated a heavy combination. Ward was knocked completely unconscious in the 2nd round. The gamble failed. The Syndicate tossed him right back down into the light heavyweight slaughterhouse. Ward clawed his way back to relevance. He fought constantly, completely ignoring his rapidly failing vision. In 1923, he traveled to Ohio and faced Tiger Flowers. Flowers was a slick, incredibly dangerous fighter who would later win a legitimate world middleweight title. Ward did not give him the space to operate. He rushed Flowers immediately off the opening bell, trapped him, and knocked him out cold in exactly 2 minutes and 50 seconds. He reclaimed his colored title, but the cartel was watching closely. The promoters and the mob-connected managers knew Ward was losing his sight. They saw him missing stationary targets. They saw him reacting late to punches coming from his blind side. The Syndicate did not offer medical intervention. They weaponized his blindness. They used his failing eyesight as leverage at the negotiating table. Promoters threatened to revoke his fighting license, citing health concerns, unless he agreed to fight for significantly lower purses. They squeezed his margins to the absolute limit. Ward refused to be starved out by corrupt managers. If the promoters refused to pay him a fair market rate, he decided to manipulate the casino mechanics himself. He began using his own capital to bet on his own fights. He bypassed the promoters entirely and leveraged the illegal gambling syndicates. In 1923, he withdrew $3,800 in cash. He placed the bet on himself against battling Siki. Ward won the fight and walked away with the bookmaker's money. In April 1924, the Syndicate booked a highly anticipated rematch with Harry Greb in Boston. Ward walked into the gambling dens and put $6,000 in cash on himself. The reality of the fight was a medical horror show. Both men entered the ring with severe hidden neurological and optical damage. Greb was entirely blind in his right eye from their previous encounter. Ward was rapidly losing vision in his left. The match devolved immediately into an illegal, dirty street brawl. The referee completely lost control of the ring. blind on one side, Ward repeatedly struck Greb below the belt. Greb retaliated with illegal elbows and headbutts. The Athletic Commission intervened, halted the fight, and suspended both men for 6 months. The massive gambling payout was frozen. By late 1924, Ward was desperate for a massive cash injection to secure his future before his eyes went completely dark. He targeted a high-profile, high-risk fight against Tommy Gibbons. Gibbons was an elite white contender who had recently gone 15 grueling rounds with Jack Dempsey. Ward went to the illegal bookmakers and dropped 10 massive bills, $10,000 in cash, betting on himself to win by knockout. It was an astronomical sum, representing years of accumulated blood money. He stepped into the ring, but his vision was heavily compromised. He could not track the speed of a top-tier heavyweight. Gibbons easily slipped Ward's attacks and countered with extreme precision. Gibbons knocked Ward out. Ward lost the fight. He lost the $10,000 cash bet. Before he even left the locker room, his own managers confiscated the remainder of his official fight purse, labeling it as management fees. The Syndicate stripped him of his capital. His retinas were dying. The cartel prepared to squeeze the last remaining drops of blood from his body before throwing him into the street. By the end of 1924, the internal biological structure of William Ward's eyes had completely collapsed. The human eye is not designed to absorb repetitive, localized, blunt force trauma from 170-pound men swinging their fists with maximum kinetic intent. Years of absorbing heavy blows to the cranium had systematically destroyed the vitreous gel inside his eyeballs. The vitreous gel maintains the spherical shape of the eye and keeps the retina attached to the back wall. As Ward absorbed concussive impacts week after week, the hydrostatic pressure inside his skull spiked. The blood vessels supplying his optic nerves ruptured. Hemorrhaging filled the optical cavity. The retinas in both eyes began to peel away from the supportive tissue. This is not a sudden, clean transition into darkness. It is a terrifying progressive decay. First, peripheral vision narrows into a tunnel. Then shadows permanently obscure the center of focus. Finally, the visual field is reduced to a milky, impenetrable blur. Ward was going completely blind. In a regulated industry, this medical reality would immediately trigger a suspension, a medical pension, and mandatory retirement. The American boxing industry in the 1920s offered none of these protections. In 1920, the New York State Legislature passed the Walker Law. The legislation officially legalized professional boxing in the state, establishing the New York State Athletic Commission. The politicians marketed the Walker Law to the public as a strict regulatory framework designed to ensure fighter safety through mandatory medical supervision and pre-fight physicals. It was a complete fraud. The Athletic Commission was not a regulatory body. It was an enforcement arm of the boxing cartel. The politicians who appointed the commissioners were directly funded by the casino bosses and the syndicate promoters who controlled the massive gate receipts at Madison Square Garden. The medical oversight was entirely compromised. The cartel managers knew exactly what was happening to Ward's vision. They observed him missing the speed bag in training. They saw him stumbling over the ropes in the gym. They recognized that he was reacting to audio cues rather than visual movement. A manager operating with a shred of human decency would have pulled him from the ring. But Ward was managed by men like Leo P. Flynn, a notoriously ruthless operator in the boxing syndicate. Flynn and the management class did not view fighters as human beings. They viewed them as depreciating industrial equipment. Kid Norfolk was a highly recognizable brand name. He generated massive action in the illegal sports books. As long as the public was willing to bet cash on the name Kid Norfolk, The Syndicate was going to put his physical body in the ring, regardless of his medical state. Flynn and the cartel orchestrated a systematic criminal medical cover-up. They directly bribed the ringside physicians employed by the Athletic Commission. The standard operating procedure was brutally efficient. Before a fight, the corrupt commission doctors were handed envelopes of cash to sign falsified medical clearance forms. They never examined Ward's eyes. When independent reporters occasionally questioned the heavy swelling or the glazed look in Ward's eyes, the management team fed deliberate lies to the press. They issued statements claiming Ward was merely suffering from temporary irritation or a minor training injury. In the locker rooms, out of sight of the public, the handlers utilized extreme chemical interventions to keep him upright. They injected local anesthetics into his face to numb the shattered orbital bones. They applied topical cocaine solutions to his eyes to force the pupils to dilate and suppress the agonizing pain of the retinal tearing. They taped his hands, shoved his mouthpiece in, and pushed a blind man out under the arena lights. Ward was entirely aware of the deception. He knew his handlers were lying to the doctors, the press, and the public. He did not object. He possessed a grim, hyper-realistic understanding of his economic position. The cartel had locked him out of the championship money. They had systematically stolen his purses through exorbitant management fees. He was staring down a permanent future of total blindness, and he knew that once his vision was completely gone, his earning potential would drop to absolute zero. He needed to extract every possible dollar from the Syndicate before his body completely failed. He weaponized his own physical destruction, signing every contract Flynn put in front of him, fully calculating the risk. It was a race against his own biological decay. He was selling the remaining shreds of his retinas for cash. Entering 1925, Ward was forced to radically alter his entire operational matrix in the ring. The ferocious, forward-moving in-fighter who had aggressively stalked and knocked out Arthur Pelkey and Abe Hollandersky was dead. Ward could no longer track a moving target. He could not see an incoming jab. He could not gauge the distance required to land his concussive hooks. He was reduced to fighting entirely on sensory feedback and survival instincts. He transformed from an offensive juggernaut into a human shield. When the bell rang, Ward would immediately step forward, extending both arms straight out in front of him into the empty air. He used his gloves like a radar system, trying to make physical contact with his opponent's torso. Once he felt the opponent, Ward would instantly collapse the distance and initiate a heavy clinch. He would wrap his massive arms around the opposing fighter, pinning their arms to their sides and burying his head deep into their chest. This was not a strategy to win the fight. It was a desperate mechanism to neutralize incoming damage. If he was clinching, the opponent could not generate the leverage required to hit him in the head. He would hold on until the referee physically separated them. As soon as the referee stepped back, Ward would absorb several brutal, unanswered punches that he never saw coming, blindly reaching out to grab hold of the man again. He spent the entirety of 1925 operating in this dark, violent loop. The crowds, unaware of the medical cover-up and frustrated by the lack of action, routinely booed him, calling him a coward and demanding blood. Ward ignored the thousands of screaming voices. He absorbed the humiliation, took the physical punishment, survived the required number of rounds, and collected his check. The Syndicate squeezed the final drops of revenue from his body over a grueling 12-month stretch. They booked him against young, fast, heavy-hitting contenders who used the blind former champion as a stepping stone to build their own records. Ward's win-loss ratio plummeted. He was taking severe, unnecessary brain trauma because he could not brace for the impact of strikes he could not see. The cartel did not care. He was fulfilling his contractual obligations, acting as high-profile cannon fodder. By early 1926, the pretense was completely exhausted. Ward was not just legally blind, he was practically operating in a void. He required his handlers to physically guide him up the arena stairs and point his shoulders toward the center of the ring before the bell rang. The ultimate exploitation culminated on March 19, 1926. The Syndicate booked Ward for a high-profile bout in San Francisco, California. The opponent was Ted Moore, an aggressive, competent fighter looking to secure a victory over a legendary name. The cartel organizers heavily promoted the fight, collecting massive gate receipts and driving up the betting action on the West Coast. The California Athletic Commission, just as corrupt as New York's, cleared Ward to fight without conducting a basic optical exam. Ward stepped into the ring for the final time. He was 33 years old. The opening bell rang. The reality of the crime immediately unfolded in front of the San Francisco crowd. Ward could not mount any offense. He shuffled forward into the void, his hands extended, desperately searching for Moore. Moore, realizing his opponent could not defend himself, began landing heavy, unimpeded shots to Ward's head and body. Ward took the punishment without returning fire, his only reaction being a frantic attempt to grab Moore and pull him into a clinch. For 3 rounds, it was not a boxing match, it was a public execution. Ward survived by repeatedly wrestling Moore into stalemates, grinding the pace of the fight to a halt. In the 4th round, the referee had seen enough. It was not out of compassion for Ward's medical state. It was because the crowd was furious. They had paid to see a violent exchange, and they were watching a man refuse to fight. The referee stepped between the fighters and officially halted the bout. He raised Moore's hand and disqualified Ward. The official ruling entered into the state ledger was a disqualification for refusing to engage. The system blamed the blind man for not walking into the fire. The immediate aftermath was swift and ruthlessly efficient. As Ward stood in the corner, unable to see the crowd hurling insults at him, the Syndicate accountants closed the books on Kid Norfolk. He had failed to provide the entertainment value required by his contract. He was now a completely defective piece of machinery. The managers did not offer him a ride to the hospital. They did not secure a medical pension. They immediately severed all ties. They voided his remaining contracts on the grounds of non-performance. They stripped him of his final purse, claiming breach of contract and management fees. They packed up their equipment and walked away. William Ward was guided out of the arena doors and abandoned on the streets of San Francisco. The cartel had successfully extracted 15 years of extreme physical labor, permanently destroyed his vision, and legally confiscated his capital. They left him in total darkness, assuming he would rapidly become just another destitute, homeless casualty of the American boxing machine. They drastically underestimated the financial countermeasures he had already put in place. The boxing syndicate abandoned William Ward in San Francisco, operating on a standard statistical model. The cartel promoters expected him to follow the predetermined trajectory of every other discarded fighter: rapid bankruptcy, homelessness, and an early, anonymous death in a back alley. They severely underestimated his intellect. Ward had spent his entire 15-year career anticipating this exact betrayal. He knew the boxing economy was a rigged casino. He never trusted the promoters, he never trusted the athletic commissions, and he never trusted the banks. 4 years before the California referee disqualified him, and the cartel stripped his license, while his retinas were actively tearing and his vision was failing, Ward executed a covert, highly strategic financial maneuver. He refused to let the syndicate confiscate his blood money. He converted his capital into hard, immovable infrastructure. On April 21, 1922, Ward bypassed the boxing establishment entirely and targeted the real estate market. He did not buy a modest property in a segregated slum. He aimed directly at Sugar Hill, an exclusive, highly restricted enclave in Harlem. The target address was 191 Edgecombe Avenue. At the time, this specific block was a rigid stronghold for German, Jewish, and Irish immigrants. Black residents were aggressively redlined out of the market through discriminatory lending practices, hostile neighborhood covenants, and the threat of violence. Ward ignored the social barriers and approached the transaction with cold corporate aggression. He dropped a purchase price of $17,000 on the table. He handed over $5,500 in raw cash, money he had extracted from the skulls of men like Harry Greb and Battling Siki, and secured a mortgage for the remainder. He drove a financial wedge into a segregated neighborhood and secured a permanent fortress for his bloodline. By the time the Syndicate formally discarded him in 1926, Ward was not homeless. He retreated directly to Edgecombe Avenue. He officially retired from the ring and moved his wife, Maria, and his daughter, Minerva, into the brownstone. He immediately converted the property into a self-sustaining revenue engine. Ward understood the massive demographic shifts occurring in New York. The Great Migration was driving thousands of Black Americans into the city, creating an explosive demand for housing. Ward bypassed the white-owned newspapers and took out classified advertisements directly in the Amsterdam News, the leading Black publication of the era. He offered rooms to middle-class Black immigrants and professionals. He transformed his home into a boarding house. By 1930, census records show he was actively collecting rent from 8 separate tenants living under his roof. He became a landlord, utilizing the same ruthless capitalism the boxing promoters had used against him, but deploying it to build a community rather than destroy one. He inadvertently became a foundational piece of the early infrastructure that built the Harlem Renaissance. Inside the brownstone, the medical reality of his boxing career finalized its course. His right eye, completely destroyed by the blunt force trauma sustained in the ring, became necrotic. It had to be surgically removed from his skull to prevent a lethal infection from reaching his brain. His left eye completely degraded into a dense, milky cataract. He was plunged into absolute, permanent blackness. He could not see the walls of the house he owned. He could not see the faces of his tenants. He could not see his own daughter. His wife, Maria, stepped into the void. She became his designated navigator. She guided him through the streets, read his financial documents, managed his rent collections, and handled the visual logistics of his life. For decades, Maria operated as his only tether to the physical world outside his own mind. The rental income secured the mortgage, but it did not generate massive wealth. Ward refused to rely on charity, and he refused to become a cautionary tale. He adapted to the darkness and went back to work. He secured a position as a trainer at Grupp's gym in Harlem, working alongside his former heavyweight rival, Harry Wills. He used his remaining physical senses, the sound of feet pivoting on the canvas, the specific snap of a leather glove, to teach young fighters the mechanics of leverage and survival. When the gym money dried up, he did not hesitate to return to the bottom of the labor pool. In the 1940s, the man who had once fought in front of 14,000 screaming spectators at Madison Square Garden took a job as a janitor at a New York shipyard. He pushed a broom in the dark for an annual salary of $720. He treated the humiliation with absolute indifference. He was simply trading manual labor for capital, exactly as he had done in the mud of the Panama Canal 30 years earlier. Eventually, leveraging local political connections, he secured a stable, pension-backed position within the New York State Department of Labor. He systematically outworked the system that tried to starve him. Despite the surgical removal of his eye, his advancing age, and his heavy, deteriorating physique, the baseline neurological programming of Kid Norfolk never degraded. He was a weapon built in the Culebra Cut and hardened in the slaughterhouses of the boxing syndicate. One night on a Harlem sidewalk, that programming was violently triggered. Ward was walking alone. He was a heavy, slow-moving, visibly blind older man. Two young street muggers identified him as an unprotected asset. They profiled him as an easy target for a quick robbery. They approached him in the dark and launched a physical assault, expecting the old man to collapse and surrender his cash. They made a fatal miscalculation. The moment the muggers made physical contact, Ward's combat mechanics engaged. He did not need to see them to destroy them. Once they were inside his reach, his spatial awareness and grappling instincts took over. He seized the two young men with hands heavily calcified by decades of impact. He didn't just defend himself, he executed a brutal close-quarters demolition. He shattered their posture, dragged them to the pavement, and delivered massive, unmitigated blunt force trauma with his bare hands. The mugging instantly devolved into a one-sided massacre on the concrete. The violence escalated to the point that local residents called the police. When the NYPD cruisers arrived on the scene, the officers did not have to rescue the blind man. They had to physically pry a heavily breathing, blind William Ward off the two battered, bloodied, and completely broken muggers lying on the sidewalk. Ward proved that the cartel could take his money and his eyesight, but they could never extract the violence from his bones. He remained an apex predator, functioning perfectly in the dark. The year 1960 triggered the final systemic collapse of William Ward's immediate world. For over 4 decades, Maria Ward had been the structural foundation of his existence. She was not just his wife, she was his operational tether to reality. Since the boxing syndicate systematically destroyed his retinas in the mid-1920s, Maria had functioned as his only set of eyes. She navigated him through the streets of New York, managed the financial ledgers of their boarding house, and shielded him from the predatory forces that constantly circled vulnerable, disabled men in Harlem. In 1960, Maria died. Her death completely severed Ward's visual connection to the outside world. He was left in a state of absolute, unmitigated isolation. The brownstone at 191 Edgecombe Avenue, once a bustling hub for black professionals during the Harlem Renaissance, descended into total silence. The external world was accelerating. The 1960s brought explosive civil rights movements, massive social upheaval, and a new generation of vocal, politically active black athletes demanding equity. Ward existed completely outside of this new era. The man who had physically battered the unwritten color line and permanently blinded the white syndicate's most feared enforcer was now trapped in a silent, dark house. The boxing establishment had long forgotten him. The sports writers who had called him an ape and a tar baby were dead or retired. He was a ghost operating in the epicenter of Sugar Hill, a relic of a completely unregulated, brutal era of casino capitalism. Despite his physical deterioration and total blindness, Ward's executive functioning remained strictly analytical. He knew his own biological clock was expiring. He also understood the historical mechanics of American wealth distribution. He knew that when an elderly disabled black man died, the state apparatus, the banks, and the municipal tax authorities immediately moved in to liquidate and absorb his assets. Ward refused to allow the system to execute a final robbery. He had absorbed thousands of concussive blows to his skull to purchase the Edgecombe property. He intended to secure it permanently. In 1966, Ward executed a preemptive legal strike. He initiated a formal transfer of deeds. Bypassing any ambiguity in probate courts, he legally signed over total unencumbered ownership of the 191 Edgecombe Avenue brownstone directly to his daughter, Minerva. This was not a sentimental gesture. It was a cold, calculated asset protection strategy. By transferring the property while he was still alive, he completely locked out the banks and state liquidators. He legally fortified his bloodline. Minerva Ward would live in that house, safe and financially secure, until her own death in 2015. Ward ensured that the wealth he generated in the ring remained strictly within his family. On April 26, 1969, William Ward's biological systems failed. He died at the age of 75. Some conflicting municipal archives record the death year as 1968, a final clerical error highlighting the total indifference of the state. There was no public mourning. There were no massive stadium tributes. The major syndicates and promoters who built their early casino empires on his blood did not send representatives. The funeral was held in absolute silence at St. Charles Borromeo Church. The man who terrified Jack Dempsey was buried without fanfare alongside Maria in Old St. Raymond Cemetery in the Bronx. His remains were placed in Section 21, Row 18, Plot 101. The location was modest, quiet, and completely disconnected from the blinding lights of Madison Square Garden. 38 years after his death, the boxing establishment attempted a historical revision. In 2007, the International Boxing Hall of Fame officially inducted Kid Norfolk. They printed his name on a plaque. They issued press releases praising his resilience. It was a completely hollow, cynical transaction. The induction cost the modern boxing promoters nothing. A piece of metal in a museum in upstate New York could not retroactively reattach his retinas. It could not refund the hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen by corrupt management. The official recognition was merely the system attempting to wash its own hands of a historical crime. The true legacy of Kid Norfolk requires no plaques and no institutional validation. His story exposes the absolute, unfiltered reality of the early American sports industry. It was a sophisticated meat grinder. The capitalist machinery was designed to take desperate laborers, extract every ounce of physical trauma they could endure, convert that trauma into massive gambling revenue for the promoters, and discard the empty human shells into the street. William Ward survived the machine. He stepped into a rigged system, absorbed unimaginable violence, and outsmarted the men trying to bleed him dry. His ultimate victory was not a championship belt. His victory was a brick fortress on Edgecombe Avenue, bought with his own blood and kept entirely out of their hands.